were in charge of the New York Times or a major publication, how do you cover the Trump administration in a way that's critical, but also not hysterical? How do you strike that balance?
Yeah, the only thing I know that's harder than running against Donald Trump as a candidate is covering him. He's very difficult to cover because he lies all the time. He does things that are outside the norms of how people behave, and there are a lot of Trump supporters who would admit that he's rude to people sometimes. He's abrasive, and lots of people voted for Donald Trump who think January 6th was an outrage, not necessarily believing that he encouraged the people to go storm the Capitol, but sitting in the White House and doing nothing about it, even when he was told by members of his family and his staff to do something. A lot of people find that outrageous. So I believe that the press should think about covering him fairly by scrutinizing what he does and not making things up. So the vice president, a big part of her speech was about there are good people on both sides and there'll be a bloodbath if he wins. And saying those things as the centerpiece of indicting Donald Trump that are just lies, and never once holding her accountable, never once saying she's saying things that are untrue. So I'm for trying to treat everybody equally, not a different standard for Donald Trump, not an easier standard, but the same standard. Now that's hard to do because not everything is an apple to apples. But I would, so here are the baseline things I would do if the New York Times hired me as a consultant and say, we've seen the light, we no longer want to be unfair. I would say, stop writing things about Donald Trump that are unfair or false, and stop quoting Democrats saying false things about him as if they're true. That's one thing I would do. Then I would say, focus on how what he does affects the real lives of real people. Don't focus on the parlor games of Washington, or he was rude to a senator, or he made a joke that some people didn't like. Focus on what he does that affects the real lives of real people.
Yeah.
Stop assuming that if someone says something about him, even on the record, stop saying, well, General Kelly must be telling the truth and Donald Trump must be lying. That's not the way it normally goes. They let anyone make an accusation about him and they build their news coverage around it. Stop doing that. And then start over with editors and reporters and say, are you indifferent to the success of Donald Trump as a candidate or as a president? Are you for the public interest, or do you have an ideological rooting interest to stop Donald Trump's agenda? And if their answer is they have an ideological rooting interest, tell them to go work someplace else. Fill the newsroom with people who want to hold powerful interests, including Donald Trump, accountable to the public interest, and take out all the liberals, because they will always revert back to being liberal and to being against Donald Trump. If you asked the reporters for the 10 major news organizations in the US covering the election, and they were honest, who do you want to win, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? Hogan, what do you think, 99-1?
Probably.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. To have people have a rooting interest against one of the candidates, doesn't make sense. The last thing I would do is I would hire, I wouldn't let political reporters write the policy stories, because most political reporters don't know anything about policy. So if Donald Trump makes a speech about healthcare, have it covered by the healthcare reporter who understands healthcare and is not liberally biased, not a political reporter who doesn't know a thing about it. Those are the first things I do. Hogan, did I forget anything?
No, there are more things you could add, I'm sure. I think one of the things is frustrating, and I started in journalism, and I had a professor who was a socialist atheist, but if you put an editorialized word in the story, he would fail it immediately. There was no question about it. It wasn't like 5 points off. It was just done. So I was brought up in that journalism school of just straight reporting, even though I was clearly a Republican and biased. But I can't tell you the amount of times when I was in the White House, a reporter would come in and say, hey, I have someone at the Pentagon who's telling me Donald Trump said X in a meeting. And I was like, okay, is it on the record? No, they'll only go on background. I was like, okay, well, I was in the meeting. I can go on the record and tell you exactly what happened, and that didn't happen. And they would go, I'm confident in my reporting. And I'm like, to the person who's not going to go on the record? Yeah, I believe them. And I'm like, but I was in the meeting. I can tell you every player, like, and whatever. And they're just like, no, too bad. And so, it's kind of our side saying, why is no one fired? Well, because they told them what to do, but no one reported on it at the time. I know it's convoluted. I'm just saying it's so frustrating because I deal with them every day. and to watch them go apoplectic, as you just said, talking about Arnold Palmer's penis at a rally, mischaracterizing it and going, ballistic when Barack Obama made a joke way more obvious and offensive just weeks prior, just kind of shows the pearl clutching and the ridiculous nature of a lot of things they try to do to us.
Yeah, the same reporters, editors, correspondents who spent 3 years covering up Joe Biden's loss of mental acuity in conspiracy with the White House are the same people who are covering the Trump administration. Same people. How can the Trump administration and people who support the Trump administration think that those people who not only engaged in a conspiracy of cover-up for 3 years, but have never acknowledged their role in it, even after Joe Biden stepped down, how could any conservative, any Trump supporter say, well, that's right, those are the right people to tell the American people what's going on with Donald Trump? Number two, when I talked about the real lives of real people, everybody here is familiar with women whose families have told, and either told their own stories or told their family members' stories, who have been adversely affected by the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Those women and their families are profiled in the news all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. President Trump in 2016 and 2024 highlighted the stories of families whose loved ones were victims of crime by people in the country illegally. And the media never talks about those people. They never profile them. They never interview them. They never feature them. They never write about them. And I can tell you, conservative media does. And they are emotionally resonant. And that's about the real lives of real people. So I would say, if an administration, a normal administration of a Democrat is pushing a certain policy, we need to deport people in the country illegally who've killed Americans, American citizens. If that were a Democratic administration, those families would be on the Today Show.
Yes.
They'd have long profiles in the New York Times. They would be iconic. And you will never once read about them. And Donald Trump, a few days before the election at Mar-a-Lago, did an event and featured those families. And he also featured the families of a woman whose daughter-in-law died in Afghanistan. I know that happened because I watched it live on YouTube. Most people here don't know it happened because there was not a word written about it in the dominant media, not one word. And how you can justify that discrepancy. Talk about the real lives of real people. Kamala Harris never called those families. That matters to those families, and it matters to a lot of military families.